The next day started quietly, but there was a strange tension in the air. The guards moved around as usual, unlocking cells and calling out names for work duty. But something in the mood had shifted since yesterday. The prisoners seemed restless, whispering among themselves, glancing at the guards with half-hidden grins. It was the kind of silence before a storm, when no one knows what might happen, but everyone feels it coming. One of the inmates sitting at the breakfast table pushed his tray away and said, "I'm not working today." His tone wasn't loud, but it carried enough weight to make the others at the table pause. A few inmates looked around, waiting for a guard to react. The nearest officer stopped mid-step but didn't say anything. He simply looked at the man for a moment, then continued walking as if he hadn't heard. The quiet defiance spread faster than anyone expected. Two others refused to move for work duty. A few started laughing, making jokes about how the guards wouldn't do anything. Even the ones who weren't involved couldn't help but watch. It was unusual, nobody ever ignored an order that openly. Some found it amusing, others felt uneasy, sensing that the situation could go wrong. By mid-morning, it wasn't just 2 or 3 prisoners who were refusing to work. It had become a quiet rebellion, small but noticeable. The guards gave warnings, but no one shouted or fought. It was more like a test of patience, of limits, of who truly had control inside those walls. In the center of it all stood the head officer. He was a man who rarely raised his voice. He didn't need to. His calmness carried more strength than any threat. When he entered the common hall, the talking stopped almost instantly. Everyone watched him. He looked around slowly, not saying a word, just studying every face. His silence felt louder than any order. One of the prisoners muttered, "What's he gonna do, stare us into working?" The others chuckled quietly. The head officer's eyes met his, but he didn't react. He simply gave a small nod and walked away. That small gesture confused them more than any punishment could have. Usually when someone broke the rules, there were quick consequences. But today nothing happened. No shouts, no orders, no lockups. It was as if the guards had agreed to ignore the behavior entirely. It made the inmates feel powerful, or at least they thought so at first. During lunch, the conversation turned bold. "They're scared," one said. "That's why they're quiet." Another laughed. "Maybe we run this place now." The laughter grew louder, but there was also an unease hiding behind it. Deep down, everyone knew the head officer wasn't the kind of man to let things slide. His silence wasn't weakness. It was something else, something calculated. Later that afternoon, as the sun started to drop behind the tall fences, the prisoners were called to gather in the yard. They came slowly, curious, unsure what was coming. The air was heavy with anticipation. The head officer stood near the center, his arms folded behind his back. A few guards stood nearby, quiet and still. When everyone was there, he finally spoke, his voice calm and steady. "I've heard many of you think the rules here are unfair," he said. "You think authority is just about control." No one responded. He looked around. "So today we'll test that idea." The prisoners exchanged confused looks. One of them asked, "And what kind of test?" The officer simply said, "For the next few hours there will be no orders. No guards telling you what to do. You will have the freedom you believe you want." At first they thought he was joking, but then the guards began walking toward the gates. They didn't leave the prison entirely, but they stepped away, far enough that they weren't hovering over anyone. They stood quietly at a distance, watching. The prisoners were left standing there in disbelief. The officer spoke again. "You say you want control. Then take it. But remember, freedom without order has its own price." Then he turned and walked off, leaving the yard in complete silence. For a moment, nobody moved. The quiet was strange, almost eerie. Then someone laughed. "This is our day," he said loudly. A few joined in, clapping and cheering. The tension that had filled the air earlier started to shift into excitement. The idea of doing whatever they wanted felt too good to resist. They started wandering around, talking loudly, making their own rules. Someone took over the exercise area and told others to stay out. Another group claimed a corner of the yard as theirs. It was playful at first, just small acts of independence. But soon those small acts turned into arguments. Someone shouted about taking more food from the kitchen. Another disagreed. Before long, words turned sharp. It wasn't violent, but the tone was changing fast. Without the guard's quiet presence, every little disagreement felt bigger. No one knew who was in charge anymore. By evening, what began as laughter had turned into frustration. Some tried to organize tasks: who would clean, who would handle meals, but no one listened. Everyone wanted to lead and no one wanted to follow. The same people who had mocked authority earlier now found themselves in endless debates over small things. As night fell, the mood grew heavier. Some prisoners sat alone thinking. Others argued in low voices about what they should do next. The freedom that had felt exciting only hours earlier now seemed confusing. There were no rules, no structure, no peace, just noise and uncertainty. Inside the main building, the head officer watched quietly through the window. He didn't smile or show any satisfaction. He simply observed. To him, this wasn't about punishment. It was about understanding. He knew that words wouldn't teach these men what authority meant. Only experience would. By late evening, the yard that had been loud all day began to quiet down. Groups that had been fighting were now sitting apart, tired and uneasy. Some started whispering, wondering when the guards would return. Others avoided eye contact, ashamed of how quickly things had fallen apart. When the head officer finally stepped outside again, the silence deepened. Every prisoner turned to look at him. He walked slowly, stopping in the middle of the yard. "Have you enjoyed your freedom?" he asked softly. No one answered. He looked around again, his voice calm. Freedom isn't chaos. Authority doesn't exist to take away your control. It exists to keep balance, to stop this place from turning into what you saw today. He didn't lecture them further. He just turned and walked away again, leaving them to think about his words. The guards resumed their normal positions, quietly restoring order. The prisoners followed the instructions without complaint, too tired and too thoughtful to resist. That night, the prison was silent. Even the usual chatter before lights out was gone. The men lay on their bunks, each thinking about what had happened, the brief taste of freedom, the confusion, the loss of order, and the strange calm that followed. None of them said it out loud, but they all felt it. Something inside them had changed. They had tested the limits, and now they understood that authority wasn't about fear. It was about keeping a fragile peace that they had taken for granted. As the lights went off and the night deepened, the walls seemed quieter than ever before. The head officer walked through the corridor one last time before resting. He didn't say a word, but he knew the lesson had begun. It wasn't finished yet, but the silence told him that the message was starting to reach them, one thought at a time. The next morning arrived quietly, but it didn't feel like any other day. The early light crept through the small windows, touching the cold walls of the prison. Usually mornings were noisy, the sound of metal doors opening, the chatter of men getting ready for breakfast, the guards calling out names. But today it was strangely calm. Nobody spoke much. The events of yesterday still weighed heavy on everyone's mind. The head officer walked through the hallway as he always did, hands behind his back, face unreadable. The guards followed him silently, respecting his quiet rhythm. When he reached the yard, he stopped and looked around. The ground still showed traces of yesterday's chaos. Papers scattered, benches moved, things left out of place. But now it was silent, as if the building itself was holding its breath. When the prisoners came out for roll call, they moved slowly, heads lowered. They weren't afraid. They were thoughtful. It was the kind of silence that comes after a storm, when people are still trying to make sense of what happened. The officer looked at them for a moment, then said in a calm tone, "Yesterday I gave you what you wanted, freedom without control. Tell me, did it make you stronger?" No one answered. A few looked at each other, unsure what to say. One man finally muttered, "It didn't feel like freedom." The officer nodded slightly, as if he had been expecting that response. He turned to the guards and said, "Let them return to their work." The order was simple, but the tone carried meaning. The prisoners followed without protest. The same men who had refused to move the day before now obeyed quietly. It wasn't fear that guided them. It was understanding. Throughout the morning, the usual routines returned. Some cleaned the corridors. Others worked in the kitchen or the workshop. The guards didn't have to repeat instructions. For the first time in a long while, everything flowed smoothly. Yet even in that calm, something deeper was happening. The men were watching the officers differently now. They were starting to see the structure that kept everything from falling apart. Around midday, the head officer gathered everyone again in the yard. The sun was bright and the air felt heavy with expectation. The prisoners stood in a loose circle around him. He waited until every whisper faded, then said slowly, "I didn't remove authority to punish you. I wanted you to feel what happens when order disappears. Yesterday you learned what chaos looks like. Today you will learn what balance feels like." The men listened quietly. There was no laughter, no smart remarks. The lesson wasn't about fear anymore, and it was about truth. The officer called a few men forward, the same ones who had been the loudest in their defiance. They stepped out looking uneasy. "You wanted to lead yesterday," he said. "Do you still want to?" They shook their heads. He didn't scold them. Instead, he said, "Leadership isn't about control. Authority isn't about power. It's about responsibility. Without it, everything you rely on collapses." His words were simple, but they hit deep. Everyone in that yard understood what he meant, even if they didn't say it out loud. After that, he told them to organize themselves into groups for different tasks: cooking, cleaning, maintenance. The guards stood back, allowing the prisoners to decide. It took a few minutes of awkward silence, but soon they started talking. There were small disagreements at first, but they worked through them. Slowly, the noise turned into cooperation. The officer watched quietly, letting them find their rhythm again. As the day went on, something unexpected happened. The same prisoners who once mocked the rules began helping others follow them. One man reminded another to stay in line, not because he was told to, but because he wanted to keep things steady. Another volunteered to fix the benches they had broken the day before. There was a sense of pride in doing things right this time. It wasn't forced. It was chosen. By late afternoon, the yard looked different. Cleaner, calmer, almost peaceful. The guards noticed the change too. They exchanged quiet looks, understanding that something meaningful was taking root. For the first time in a long while, both sides, the officers and the inmates, shared a quiet respect that didn't need words. When evening came, the officer walked the corridors again. He passed by the cells, stopping now and then to speak to someone. His words were never harsh. He asked simple questions. "How was your day?" Or "Did you learn something from yesterday?" Small moments like that built trust in ways that punishments never could. Later, during dinner, the atmosphere was lighter. People talked softly, sharing stories, even laughing a little. The guards didn't have to shout or remind anyone to behave. Order came naturally now. It was strange, almost peaceful, and everyone felt it. As the night approached, the officer called one of the guards to his office. The younger guard looked curious. "Sir," he asked, "you could have punished them yesterday. Why didn't you?" The officer smiled faintly and said, "Punishment teaches obedience. Experience teaches understanding. I don't want them to fear authority. I want them to respect it." That short conversation stayed in the young guard's mind for a long time. He began to see his job differently, not as someone who enforced rules, but as someone who helped keep balance inside walls that could easily turn into chaos. Meanwhile, in the dorm rooms, the prisoners talked quietly among themselves. One of them said, "I never realized how much those rules keep us from turning on each other." Another nodded. "When they stepped back yesterday, I thought we'd be free. But it was worse than any lockup. There was agreement all around. The lesson had reached them in a way no lecture could have." That night, as the lights dimmed, the officer looked out from his small office window. The yard was empty and quiet. The same men who once shouted and joked now rested silently, their minds calmer than before. He knew the change wasn't complete. Lessons like these take time. But something had shifted. The wall between authority and defiance had started to crack. He thought about the word authority itself. To most people, it meant control, power, or command. But to him, it meant something softer: guidance, stability, the invisible hand that kept everything from breaking. He didn't want to be feared. He wanted to be understood. Before leaving his office, he wrote a note for the next day's briefing. "Continue the lesson. Respect is built, not forced." In the quiet of the prison night, the sound of footsteps echoed faintly in the halls. The guards walked their usual rounds, keys jingling softly. For the first time in many days, those sounds didn't feel heavy. They felt safe. The prisoners lay in their bunks listening, and some even felt a strange comfort in knowing that someone was watching over them, not as enemies, but as keepers of order. When dawn came the next day, the light fell differently on the cold floors. The world inside those walls hadn't changed completely, but it had begun to heal. The men rose for another day, not because they were ordered to, but because something inside them now understood why rules existed. They moved with quiet purpose, their steps steady and sure. The head officer stood by the entrance watching them file out for roll call. He didn't smile, but his eyes showed calm satisfaction. The hardest part of the lesson was over. They had seen both sides, chaos and order, and chosen which one they wanted to live by. It was no longer about who held authority. It was about everyone learning to share responsibility. That simple shift was enough to change everything inside those walls. The day felt lighter, the air less heavy. Respect had started to replace fear, and that was something no punishment could ever achieve. Days passed, and the mood inside the prison began to shift in small but meaningful ways. The tension that once filled the air was fading. The inmates spoke in softer voices. Arguments had grown rare, and the guards seemed more relaxed. It was as if both sides had found a rhythm that balanced control and respect. But beneath that calm, something deeper was still unfolding. A quiet transformation in the way everyone thought about authority. The head officer observed this change carefully. He didn't rush it or interfere much. Every day he walked through the corridors with the same slow, steady steps. The prisoners had grown used to his presence. The sound of his boots on the concrete, the jingle of his keys, the calm look in his eyes. He never yelled, never needed to. His quietness carried a weight that spoke louder than commands. One afternoon, as the sun poured through the barred windows, the officer decided to hold another meeting in the yard. It had been nearly a week since the day of chaos, and he knew the men were ready for another lesson. One not of control, but of reflection. The prisoners gathered slowly, some curious, others hesitant. They stood in loose lines, waiting for him to speak. He looked at them for a while before saying, "You've seen what happens when there's no order. You've also seen what happens when rules are respected. But now I want you to understand something deeper. That authority is not always outside of you. It can also live within you." The men listened silently. His words were simple, but they struck a nerve. One man finally asked, "How can authority be inside us?" The officer smiled faintly. "Because real strength isn't about forcing others to listen. It's about learning to control yourself, your temper, your pride, your fear. If you can't guide yourself, you can't guide anyone else." A quiet murmur spread among the prisoners. They weren't used to hearing things like this. For many of them, the idea that authority could be something internal was new. They had always seen it as something imposed and something to resist or fear. But now they were starting to see that maybe it could mean something more. The officer continued, "Every man here has a choice. You can keep blaming the system, the guards, or your past. Or you can take responsibility on not for punishment but for change." His words didn't sound like a speech. They sounded honest, like someone speaking from experience. The yard stayed quiet long after he finished talking. Later that day, the officer assigned small leadership tasks to a few of the inmates. He asked one group to oversee kitchen work, another to manage cleaning schedules, and another to organize reading sessions in the small library. These weren't punishments or privileges. They were tests of trust. Some prisoners looked surprised. They weren't used to being trusted with anything meaningful, but they accepted the tasks quietly. Over the next few days, those groups started working together. At first, it was awkward. There were disagreements, small mistakes, and moments of doubt. But with time, things began to run smoothly. The men started holding themselves accountable. They reminded each other to stay on track, to follow schedules, to keep things fair. The guards still watched, but they didn't have to interfere much anymore. Something remarkable began to happen. The same prisoners who once laughed at authority were now helping to maintain it. They made sure everyone got their share of food, kept the halls clean, and even stopped small arguments before they grew. It wasn't fear that guided them anymore. It was respect for the order that gave them peace and for themselves. The head officer noticed these small victories with quiet satisfaction. He didn't praise them loudly, but he acknowledged their progress in simple ways. A nod, a calm word, a small smile. For men who had lived most of their lives feeling invisible, those gestures meant more than any reward. One evening, while the men were gathered in the common hall, the officer walked in unexpectedly. Conversation stopped as he entered. He looked around and said, "A week ago you were ready to turn against each other. Today you stand together. That's not because of me. It's because you decided to understand what authority really means. He paused and looked toward one of the prisoners who had once been the loudest voice of rebellion. The man lowered his eyes, but the officer called on him gently. "Tell them what you've learned," he said. The man hesitated for a moment, then spoke quietly. "I thought rules were chains, but now I see they're what keep us from losing ourselves. When we lost them, we lost each other." The room stayed silent after that. No one mocked his words. No one laughed. They all understood exactly what he meant. In the following days, the atmosphere continued to change. Even small routines began to carry a sense of pride. The kitchen crew started cooking with care. The cleaning group made sure the hall stayed spotless. Some men began reading in the evenings, using the time they once spent arguing or sleeping. The guards began to trust the inmates more, and the inmates in turn trusted the guards. One morning, the officer visited the workshop where some prisoners were repairing furniture. He watched them for a while, then asked, "How's it going?" One of them smiled shyly and said, "Better than before, sir. Feels good to fix something instead of breaking it." The officer nodded, replying softly, "That's what authority does. It helps fix what's broken, not just around you but inside you too." Later that evening, the officer stood outside watching the sunset paint the sky behind the tall fences. The prison, once filled with noise and defiance, now echoed with calm voices and quiet movement. It wasn't perfect, but it was different, and he could feel the difference deeply. Inside, some prisoners were talking about what they would do once they got out. Their dreams were small but sincere: to work, to help their families, to stay out of trouble. They weren't making promises to impress anyone. They were speaking from a place of new understanding. For the first time in a long time, they believed change was possible. That night, the officer called the guards together for a short meeting. He told them, "Authority is strongest when it doesn't need to show its strength. What we've done here, it's not about control. It's about respect. Remember that." The guards nodded, understanding the weight behind his words. They had seen the difference themselves. Before lights out, the officer walked one last round through the sleeping quarters. The men were quiet, lying on their bunks peacefully. Some were already asleep, others just staring at the ceiling, lost in thought. The officer stopped near the end of the hall, listening to the stillness. It wasn't just silence. It was peace, the kind that comes when people finally understand each other. He turned off the last light and walked back to his office. Outside, the night air was cool and the stars looked faint beyond the prison walls. He knew the journey wasn't over. There would still be challenges, still moments of anger or disobedience. But something inside those men had shifted permanently. They had seen both sides, chaos and order, and they had chosen order. That was the day the head officer realized his lesson had worked. The prisoners hadn't just learned the meaning of authority, they had begun to carry it within themselves. And for the first time, the prison no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a place where broken men had started to rebuild, one quiet decision at a time. The next morning, the sky was pale and soft with early light. A thin fog rested over the yard and everything felt quiet, almost peaceful. The head officer stood near the gate watching the prisoners come out for roll call. Their steps were slow but steady, their faces calm. The shouting, laughter, and arguments that once filled the air were gone. Now there was only the quiet sound of footsteps and the faint clink of metal keys from the guards. As the men lined up, the officer spoke softly. It's been some time since that day. His voice carried through the yard, firm but kind. You've learned what happens when there's no control. You've learned what happens when there's balance. Today I want you to understand something else. What real respect feels like. The men looked at him silent. They no longer saw him as just a uniform or a symbol of power. They saw someone who had shown them something deeper: discipline without cruelty, strength without anger. After the roll call, the officer asked a few of them to follow him to the main hall. There was a long table set up with notebooks, pencils, and some papers. It was unusual. The prisoners exchanged puzzled glances as they sat down. The officer said, "Today I want you to write something. Not about what you did to end up here, but about what you've learned since that day in the yard." Some of the men hesitated. Many of them hadn't written anything in years. One of them said quietly, "What's the point?" The officer replied, "Because when you write something down, you see yourself more clearly. Sometimes words can change a man more than punishment ever can. For a few minutes the room was silent except for the soft scratching of pencils. Some wrote about anger, others about regret, but slowly the words started to change. They wrote about patience, about understanding, about how order made them feel safe. One man wrote, "Authority is not against us. It protects us from what we can become when we lose control." When he finished, he looked surprised, as if those words had come from a place he didn't know existed inside him. Later that day, the officer gathered everyone in the yard again. He asked a few volunteers to read what they had written. The men read nervously, their voices shaky at first but growing stronger with each sentence. Each story was different, but they all carried the same truth: that authority was no longer something to fight against, but something to respect, even value. The rest of the prisoners listened quietly. For the first time, there were no interruptions or mocking laughs. They were listening, truly listening, to one another. It was a rare kind of silence, one filled with connection and understanding. When the last man finished reading, the officer said, "You've learned more in these few weeks than some people learn in a lifetime. You've learned that real strength doesn't come from rebellion. It comes from responsibility." After that, things in the prison began to change even more. The officers didn't have to shout anymore. The men woke up on time, did their duties without being told, and kept the place clean. Even small things started to matter. They greeted the guards politely, shared their food, and helped each other. There were still rules, but now those rules didn't feel like walls, they felt like guides. One afternoon, as the sun warmed the concrete yard, a new group of inmates arrived. They were loud, restless, and curious. They looked around expecting tension, maybe even fear, but what they saw surprised them. The older inmates were calm, organized, and respectful. One of them said quietly to a newcomer, "You'll learn fast here. This place teaches you more than you think." The new inmates didn't understand at first, but over time they began to see it too. The head officer continued to walk his rounds every day, quietly observing. He didn't have to say much anymore. The peace inside those walls spoke for itself. He had seen anger turn to reflection, defiance turn to discipline, and broken men begin to find strength again. That transformation was his greatest reward. One evening, a storm rolled in. Rain poured down loud against the roofs and windows. Most of the inmates stayed inside, sitting in silence. The officer stood by his window watching the rain. The sound reminded him of that first day, the chaos, the shouting, the defiance. It felt like a lifetime ago. He thought about how far they had all come. The storm outside didn't bother him anymore. He knew that inside those walls, peace would hold steady. A few days later, something unexpected happened. The prison received news that a few of the men were going to be released early for good behavior. The announcement brought mixed emotions: joy, fear, disbelief. Some of the men had been there so long that freedom almost felt unreal. The officer gathered them together before their departure. He looked at each one carefully and said, "When you go out there, remember what you learned here. The world outside will test you just like it tested you in here, but if you carry discipline within you, you'll never lose control." One of the men asked, "How do we make sure we don't forget?" The officer smiled gently. "By remembering that authority doesn't end at the gate. It lives in the choices you make every day." When the day of release came, the men packed their few belongings and stood by the main gate. The other inmates watched quietly, proud but emotional. The officer shook each of their hands one by one, not as a warden saying goodbye, but as a teacher sending his students into the world. The gate opened, and for a moment sunlight flooded in, washing the dull walls with warmth. The men stepped out, not running, not looking back in fear, but walking steadily toward their new beginning. That night, the prison felt unusually still. The officer walked the empty hallways, his footsteps echoing softly. He could feel the quiet satisfaction of knowing that something meaningful had taken root. Not just discipline, but understanding. Authority was no longer a battle between sides. It had become a bridge between them. Weeks passed and life continued as usual. The guards and inmates now shared a silent rhythm, one built on respect, not force. The yard was cleaner, the work faster, the laughter genuine. Even the new inmates slowly began to blend into this new order, guided not by rules written on paper, but by lessons carried in the heart. One morning, the officer stood near the same spot where it had all started. He watched the men working in the yard, calm, steady, purposeful. He thought back to that day when chaos had filled this space, and how that chaos had turned into one of the greatest lessons of his career. The memory made him smile quietly. The men had learned the meaning of authority, not through punishment but through experience, understanding, and patience. As the sun climbed higher, a soft breeze moved through the yard. The officer took a deep breath and turned toward his office. He knew there would always be new challenges, new faces, new lessons, but for now he was content. The walls around him no longer felt like barriers. They felt like witnesses to change, to growth, and to the quiet power of respect. And so the story of that day, the day the prisoners learned the meaning of authority, became more than just a memory. It became a lesson passed on from one generation of men to another, not written in books or rules, but written in the way they carried themselves, in the calm of their voices, and in the steady rhythm of their hearts.